The betrayal. The sun was just starting to set over the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty streets of the suburban neighborhood. The golden hue of the fading light reflected off the quiet homes, each one seemingly peaceful from the outside. But behind those closed doors, tensions were rising. For Marcus, the last few weeks had been a blur of uncertainty and anger. He had always prided himself on his work ethic, his commitment to service, and his loyalty to the country, but nothing could prepare him for the betrayal that would forever change his life. It had all started when Marcus received the call to deploy overseas. It wasn't the first time he'd been called to duty. He had been in the military for over a decade, serving his country proudly. He'd missed birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings, but this time was different. It was more personal. He was leaving behind not just his family, but also his dream home, the one he and his wife, Emily, had worked so hard to build. The house was more than just walls and a roof. It was the place where their children would grow up, where they had laughed and cried, and where they had made countless memories. But as Marcus prepared for his deployment, there was one thing he didn't anticipate: the looming power of the Homeowners Association, HOA. The HOA had always been there in the background, enforcing rules, imposing fines, and managing the community's common areas. In many ways, they were like an invisible force that controlled the neighborhood, making decisions that affected everyone's lives. They had always been a minor annoyance, but nothing Marcus had ever considered a serious threat. Then came the letter. It was an official-looking envelope that arrived at Marcus's doorstep just days before he was set to leave for his deployment. At first, he thought it was just another notice about lawn maintenance or a reminder to pay his dues. But as he opened it, his stomach dropped. The letter stated that, due to a legal loophole, the HOA had sold the land under his house to a private developer. Without his knowledge, without his consent, and certainly without his approval. His home, his life, and everything he had worked for had been sold out from under him. The letter went on to explain that because Marcus had been deployed, he was technically no longer residing in the home, and according to HOA rules, the property could be sold to recover unpaid dues. Marcus couldn't believe what he was reading. He had always paid his dues on time, maintained his property, and followed all the rules. Yet here he was, staring at a piece of paper that threatened to strip him of everything he held dear. His first reaction was disbelief. He spent hours on the phone trying to get answers, but each conversation only led to more confusion. The HOA representatives were cold, distant, and unapologetic. They told him that the matter was final, that the sale was legal, and that there was nothing he could do about it. The developer was already in the process of taking ownership of the property, and soon enough, Marcus's home would be nothing more than a distant memory. It was a betrayal unlike anything he had ever experienced. The very people who were supposed to be working for the community had turned on him, using legal loopholes and technicalities to rob him of his home. He felt helpless, powerless, and angry. But Marcus wasn't one to give up easily. He had been through too much, fought too hard, and sacrificed too much for this country to let a corrupt system take away his family's future. As Marcus sat in his home, staring at the letter, a sense of determination began to rise within him. He knew he couldn't let this stand. He couldn't let the HOA get away with this injustice. It was time for him to fight back, and he would do whatever it took to reclaim what was rightfully his. But Marcus wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for his family, his neighbors, and everyone who had been wronged by the HOA's corrupt practices. This wasn't just about one man's fight. It was about standing up against a system that had abused its power for too long. And Marcus was ready to take that fight to the next level. A plan of action. Marcus couldn't believe the situation he was in. How could the HOA have gotten away with this? He had spent years being a model citizen, always following the rules, always doing his part to make his community a better place. And yet, in the blink of an eye, Everything was being ripped from him by a corrupt organization that wielded its power like a weapon. His heart sank at the thought of his wife, Emily, and their children. They had worked so hard to make their house a home, and now it was all slipping through his fingers. But as much as the betrayal stung, Marcus knew he couldn't let it defeat him. He had been trained for situations like this. As a soldier, he had faced danger head-on and come out on top. This was no different. He had to fight back this time, not with guns or strategy, but with the power of the law and the will of the people. His first step was simple. He needed to get home. Marcus knew that time was running out. The HOA had already begun making preparations to transfer ownership of the property, and the developer was set to begin construction on the land as soon as the deal was finalized. Marcus had no time to waste. He contacted his commanding officer and arranged to return home early from his deployment. The military bureaucracy was slow, but Marcus wasn't going to let that stop him. He made his case with passion and determination, explaining the urgency of the situation and the injustice he was facing. Within days, his request was approved, and Marcus found himself boarding a plane back to the States. The journey home felt like an eternity. His mind raced as he thought about what he would do when he returned. The HOA had sold his land, and now he had to find a way to make them pay for their actions. He couldn't just sit back and accept this wrong. The thought of his family losing everything pushed him forward, and he promised himself that he would never stop fighting until he had justice. When Marcus finally arrived home, the first thing he did was head straight to the local courthouse. He knew the legal system was his best chance at taking down the HOA. He enlisted the help of a lawyer who specialized in real estate disputes and civil rights cases. Together, they began to dig into the details of the sale. They uncovered a series of shady dealings, legal loopholes, and questionable decisions that had allowed the HOA to get away with this. It was clear that the HOA had taken advantage of Marcus's absence, exploiting his deployment as an opportunity to sell his land without his consent. But now Marcus had something that they didn't. He had the truth, and he was ready to expose it. The lawyer filed a series of motions to halt the sale and demand a full investigation into the HOA's actions. It wasn't going to be easy, and Marcus knew it wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time since he received the devastating letter, he felt a sense of hope. He had a plan, and he was taking action. As Marcus fought the legal battle, he also reached out to his neighbors. He wasn't alone in this fight. The HOA had been abusing its power for years, imposing unreasonable fines, enforcing absurd rules, and making life difficult for everyone in the neighborhood. Marcus knew that if he could rally the support of his neighbors, he could turn this fight into something much bigger. He began organizing meetings, gathering evidence of the HOA's wrongdoing, and speaking out against the injustice. One by one, his neighbors joined him, and soon, a full-blown movement was born. People who had once been afraid to challenge the HOA were now standing up, united by the common cause of taking back their homes and their rights. The HOA, on the other hand, didn't take kindly to the growing resistance. They sent threatening letters, imposed more fines, and attempted to intimidate Marcus and his supporters. But every move they made only fueled the fire of resistance. The people were done being pushed around. They were done being silent. It was time for change, and they were ready to fight for it. Marcus's determination and leadership became a beacon of hope for the entire community. He knew that this battle wasn't just about his land. It was about standing up to an oppressive system that had abused its power for far too long. The more he learned about the HOA's corrupt practices, the more fired up he became. He was no longer just fighting for his own home. He was fighting for justice for his neighbors and for everyone who had been wronged by the HOA's tyranny. And he was willing to do whatever it took to win. As the days passed, the pressure on the HOA increased. The media began picking up on the story, and the more attention the case received, the more the HOA's shady practices were exposed. Marcus and his neighbors had become symbols of resistance, and their fight had become a rallying cry for others facing similar struggles across the country. The story of a soldier who had been betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect his home was resonating with people everywhere. But Marcus knew that this was only the beginning. He wasn't just going to stop with the HOA. He wanted to make sure that no one else would have to go through what he had endured. He was determined to hold the HOA accountable, not just for his case, but for the countless others who had been mistreated and exploited by them. And he was ready to take the fight all the way to the top, if necessary. With the support of his neighbors, the backing of the media, and the strength of his own resolve, Marcus was more determined than ever to reclaim his home and make the HOA pay for their actions. He was no longer just a victim of a corrupt system. He was a warrior, and this fight was far from over. The legal showdown. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus found himself entrenched in a battle that felt more like a war than a simple legal dispute. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just his home on the line anymore. It was the future of his entire community. The HOA had underestimated the power of a man with nothing left to lose, and now they were facing the full force of Marcus's resolve. The legal process, as Marcus quickly discovered, was not for the faint of heart. There were countless forms to fill out, endless paperwork to file, and long hours spent in conference rooms, with his lawyer strategizing their next move. It was a grueling, exhausting process, but Marcus was determined to see it through. Each day he grew more convinced that the system, though flawed, could still work in his favor if he played the game right. One of the first hurdles was the HOA's ironclad defense. They had powerful lawyers, a vast network of connections, and a long history of operating above the law. It wasn't going to be easy to take them down. The first few rounds of hearings felt like a blur of legal jargon and technicalities, and Marcus began to wonder if he was even making a dent in the system. The HOA's lawyers had a way of twisting words and manipulating the facts, turning what should have been a straightforward case into a labyrinth of confusion. But Marcus wasn't one to back down. He had come too far to let their slick tactics throw him off course. In the midst of the legal chaos, Marcus found solace in his family and his neighbors. Emily, his wife, was his rock, offering emotional support during the darkest moments. His children, though they didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation, brought moments of joy and normalcy to his life. And his neighbors, who had once been hesitant to get involved, were now fully on board. They showed up to every meeting, every protest, every demonstration, proving that they were willing to stand with him no matter what. This sense of community, of solidarity, gave Marcus the strength to keep fighting. But it wasn't just the legal battle that Marcus had to contend with, it was the emotional toll as well. The longer the case dragged on, the more it took a toll on his mental health. The constant stress, the sleepless nights, and the overwhelming sense of injustice weighed heavily on him. There were moments when he wanted to give up, to walk away from it all and let the HOA have their way. But then he would think of his children, of the family that had worked so hard to make a life in that home, and he would push those thoughts aside. Giving up was not an option. It was during one particularly difficult week that things started to turn around. The media had picked up on Marcus's story, and it quickly gained traction. News outlets began covering the case, shining a spotlight on the HOA's corrupt practices. The more the public learned about how the HOA had exploited Marcus's deployment to steal his land, the angrier they became. Social media exploded with support for Marcus, and soon, people from all over the country were rallying behind him. The hashtag Justice for Marcus trended nationwide, and it became clear that the public was on his side. The HOA, once so confident in their ability to crush Marcus's resistance, began to falter. They had underestimated the power of public opinion. Their high-priced lawyers, once so quick to dismiss the case, were now forced to take a more defensive stance. The pressure was mounting, and Marcus knew that it was only a matter of time before the tide began to turn in his favor. Then came the breakthrough. While reviewing the HOA's records, Marcus's lawyer discovered a crucial piece of evidence, an internal email from the HOA's management team that revealed they had intentionally targeted military personnel for property sales, knowing that their absence made it easier to bypass legal requirements. This email, though seemingly small, was the smoking gun they needed to turn the case around. The HOA had violated federal law by taking advantage of soldiers' deployments in this way, and that gave Marcus the leverage he needed to launch a new wave of legal action. With this new evidence in hand, Marcus's legal team filed a motion to have the sale annulled. The judge overseeing the case was sympathetic to Marcus's plight, and after hearing the new evidence, he ruled in favor of the plaintiff. The sale of Marcus's land was put on hold, and the HOA was ordered to cease all further actions until a full investigation could be conducted. It was a massive victory, but it was only the beginning. Marcus's legal team wasted no time in using the momentum to press for further action. They filed suit against the HOA, demanding not only the reversal of the sale, but also compensation for the emotional distress and financial losses Marcus had incurred. The case was far from over, but for the first time in months, Marcus felt a sense of hope. The tide was turning, and the HOA was on the defensive. The fight, however, was not without its challenges. The HOA, now desperate to avoid a public scandal, began to retaliate. They filed motions to have the case thrown out, attempted to discredit Marcus's legal team, and even went so far as to intimidate some of his neighbors. But Marcus wasn't afraid. He had come too far to be intimidated now. The support of his community, the power of truth, and the strength of his own conviction kept him going. The battle for the neighborhood. As Marcus continued to fight the HOA in the courts, he realized that the battle was about more than just his home. It was about the very fabric of the community he had worked so hard to be a part of. The more he learned about the depths of the HOA's corruption, the more he understood just how far-reaching their control was. The HOA wasn't just managing the neighborhood. They were using their power to manipulate, exploit, and intimidate the very people they were supposed to protect. The more Marcus thought about it, the more he realized that if he didn't act, this would happen again to other homeowners, just as it had happened to him. It was in these moments of reflection that Marcus came to a profound realization. This wasn't just about him anymore. His fight for his home had transformed into a fight for his neighbors, for every single family that had ever been bullied or exploited by the HOA. He had become their voice, their advocate, and their hope for change. With every passing day, he knew that the stakes were getting higher, and the cost of failure was not just his home, it was the future of the entire neighborhood. Marcus wasn't going to fight this battle alone. He began reaching out to his neighbors, inviting them to meetings and telling them his story. At first, many of them were hesitant. They were afraid to speak out against the HOA, knowing the risks involved. The HOA had a long history of bullying residents who dared to challenge their authority, and the fear of retaliation was real. But Marcus knew that the only way to defeat the HOA's grip on the neighborhood was to unite the community. He spoke to them with passion, explaining how their fight was bigger than any one individual. He reminded them of their shared values, family, fairness, and the right to live in peace without being controlled by a group of power-hungry individuals. Slowly but surely, people began to listen. They came to the meetings, shared their own stories of being wronged by the HOA, and offered their support. As the movement gained momentum, Marcus's neighbors grew more confident. They realized that they weren't powerless. They had the strength of community behind them. They began to organize protests, speak out at HOA meetings, and share their experiences on social media. The hashtag #TakeBackOurNeighborhood spread like wildfire, and soon, the media was taking notice. What had started as a local dispute had turned into a full-blown movement. People from all over the country were following Marcus's fight, and the pressure on the HOA was mounting. The HOA, once so confident in their control over the neighborhood, began to crack. They tried to dismiss the growing resistance, but the more they did, the more they alienated the very people they had sworn to serve. The HOA's leaders, who had once hidden behind their positions of power, were now facing the consequences of their actions. The public scrutiny was intense, and their every move was being watched. But the HOA didn't back down easily. They tried to discredit Marcus, spreading rumors about his past and attempting to paint him as a troublemaker. They even went so far as to try and intimidate the families who had joined Marcus in his fight. They sent threatening letters, imposed ridiculous fines, and even used their influence to try and get people fired from their jobs. But all of this only fueled the fire of resistance. The more the HOA tried to crush Marcus and his neighbors, the stronger they became. They weren't going to be intimidated by empty threats and petty tactics. They had the power of the people on their side, and they knew it. It wasn't long before Marcus and his neighbors realized that their fight wasn't just about reclaiming their homes. It was about exposing the corruption within the HOA and holding them accountable for their actions. They began to collect evidence, documenting every illegal fine, every unfair rule, and every instance of retaliation. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the HOA had been exploiting the residents for years. They had been using their power to line their own pockets, while the homeowners were left to suffer. Marcus's lawyer, armed with this new evidence, filed a class action lawsuit against the HOA. This was the moment they had been waiting for. With the support of the community, the legal team pushed forward, demanding not only the reversal of the sale of Marcus's land, but also the end of the HOA's corrupt practices once and for all. The lawsuit was a direct challenge to the HOA's authority, and it sent shockwaves through the organization. The HOA, once so untouchable, was now facing the very real possibility of being held accountable for their actions. The battle for the neighborhood was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Marcus and his neighbors felt a sense of victory. They had taken the fight to the HOA, and they had shown the world that they wouldn't back down. The movement was growing, and they were determined to see it through to the end. But Marcus knew that there would be many more challenges ahead. The HOA wasn't going to give up easily, and the fight for justice would take time, but he was ready. He had the support of his community, the strength of his resolve, and the power of the truth on his side. And with that, he knew they could win. The turning point, the next phase of Marcus's fight, was the hardest yet. The pressure had been mounting on both sides. His legal team, fueled by public support and the mounting evidence of the HOA's corruption, was more determined than ever to take down the organization. But as the stakes grew higher, so did the HOA's desperation. In the past, they had used their power to intimidate and silence residents, but now they were facing an opponent who refused to be silenced. Marcus had transformed from a soldier, fighting for his home, into a symbol of resistance, and the HOA knew that they were at risk of losing everything they had worked so hard to control. The HOA's response to the lawsuit and the growing public outcry was swift and brutal. They hired even more powerful lawyers, attempting to bury Marcus's legal team in a mountain of paperwork and legal jargon. They tried to discredit Marcus's case, arguing that the sale of his land had been entirely legal and that the HOA had acted within their rights. But the evidence was overwhelming. Emails, documents, and testimony from other homeowners revealed a long history of unlawful practices, and the public had grown too angry to ignore it. Desperate to regain control, the HOA resorted to increasingly Extreme tactics. They began to spread vicious rumors about Marcus, trying to turn public opinion against him. They painted him as a troublemaker, a man who was trying to tear apart the community for his own selfish reasons. They used their connections to manipulate the media, hoping to discredit Marcus in the eyes of the public. But instead of breaking Marcus's spirit, these attacks only strengthened his resolve. He knew he had the truth on his side, and he wasn't about to let the HOA get away with their lies. Meanwhile, the support from the community was growing stronger. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out were now showing up at every rally, attending every meeting, and lending their voices to the cause. They had seen the way Marcus had fought for his home, and they knew that he wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for all of them. The bond between Marcus and his neighbors is deepened, and they began to see themselves not as isolated individuals, but as a united front against the corrupt forces that had been controlling their lives for far too long. Despite the public support, the HOA was determined to press forward. They filed motions to dismiss the lawsuit, attempting to use legal loopholes and technicalities to delay the proceedings. They filed injunctions to prevent Marcus from speaking out publicly, hoping to silence the movement. They even went so far as to send private investigators to dig into Marcus's personal life, trying to find anything that they could use against him. It was clear that the HOA was willing to go to any lengths to protect their power, but it was also clear that they had underestimated the strength of the community. As the legal battles dragged on, Marcus and his neighbors began to organize on a larger scale. They reached out to other homeowners across the country who had been wronged by their own HOAs, forming a nationwide network of individuals united by their shared experiences. The more they networked, the more they realized that Marcus's case was far from unique. All over the country, homeowners were fighting against corrupt HOA practices ranging from illegal fines and fees to land grabs and wrongful foreclosures. This was not just a local issue. It was a nationwide crisis that had been ignored for far too long. The momentum of the movement grew, and soon, it wasn't just the HOA that was under attack, it was the very system that allowed such organizations to exist. The laws governing homeowners associations were antiquated and, in many cases, allowed for too much unchecked power. The more Marcus learned about the widespread abuse taking place, the more determined he became to bring about real, lasting change. It wasn't just about winning his own case anymore. It was about changing the system that had allowed the HOA to destroy lives for decades. Then, in the midst of the legal battle, Marcus received a call that would change everything. A whistleblower within the HOA came forward with damning evidence. Insider who had worked for the HOA for years and had witnessed firsthand the corruption that had been allowed to fester within the organization. The whistleblower, who wished to remain anonymous, provided key documents that revealed the full extent of the HOA's illegal activities. They had been manipulating property values, forcing homeowners to sell their land for pennies on the dollar, and pocketing the difference. They had been using their influence to secure kickbacks from developers, lining their pockets while the homeowners were left in the dark. This new evidence was the breakthrough Marcus had been waiting for. With the whistleblower's testimony and the documents in hand, Marcus's legal team filed for a full investigation into the HOA's practices. This time, they weren't just asking for the sale of Marcus's land to be reversed, they were demanding that the entire HOA be investigated for corruption and illegal activities. The tide had turned. The HOA was no longer in control of the narrative, and they knew that they were facing the fight of their lives. The media coverage exploded once again, with news outlets across the country picking up the story. What had started as a local dispute had now become a national scandal. People from all walks of life were outraged by the corruption and abuse of power that had been allowed to go unchecked for so long. It wasn't just Marcus who was fighting for justice. It was every homeowner who had ever been wronged by an HOA, With the support of the community, the whistleblower's evidence, and the media attention, Marcus and his legal team were finally able to push the case to court. This was the moment of reckoning, the moment when the HOA would be forced to face the consequences of their actions. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt that victory was within his reach. He had come so far, fought so hard, and endured so much, but this was his moment. The final showdown, the day of the final trial, arrived with a heavy, almost suffocating sense of anticipation. Marcus had spent months preparing for this moment, a moment that would decide not only his future, but the future of everyone in his community. The battle had grown far beyond his own land. It had become a struggle for justice against a corrupt system that had abused its power for far too long. As he walked into the courthouse, flanked by his lawyer and his fellow homeowners, Marcus felt a quiet, burning determination. This was it. This was the day that everything would either be set right or be lost forever. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The judge, a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense demeanor, took his seat at the bench, signaling the start of the proceedings. Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The entire room was watching, not just the members of the HOA and their powerful lawyers, but the dozens of media representatives who had gathered to cover the case. It was no longer just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been wronged by the HOA. It was about holding them accountable, about showing the world that power and greed couldn't go unchecked anymore. The HOA's lawyers, once so confident in their ability to quash the case, now seemed nervous. Their usual cocky demeanor had been replaced by a palpable tension. They had fought tooth and nail to delay the trial, to bury the evidence, and to discredit Marcus. But despite all their efforts, the facts were clear, and the truth was on their side. The evidence that Marcus and his legal team had gathered over the past several months was irrefutable. There were emails, documents, testimonies, and of course, the whistleblower's testimony. Everything pointed to one undeniable truth. The HOA had deliberately and maliciously taken advantage of the residents they were supposed to protect. As the trial began, Marcus's lawyer stood up and began presenting their case. The courtroom fell silent as they methodically laid out the evidence, piece by piece, showing how the HOA had manipulated the system, exploited military personnel, and sold Marcus's land without his knowledge or consent. The whistleblower's testimony was the linchpin, and as they recounted the insider's account of the HOA's shady dealings, the room seemed to hold its breath. The HOA's lawyers tried to object, to disrupt the flow of the case, but each objection was overruled. The evidence was overwhelming, and the judge could see that the HOA had no defense left. Marcus sat in the courtroom, his heart pounding in his chest as he listened to the proceedings. He had been through so much, countless hours of legal meetings, sleepless nights, and endless uncertainty. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that he was standing up for what was right. He was standing up for his family, for his neighbors, for everyone who had been oppressed by this corrupt organization. And with every word spoken in his favor, he felt the weight of his resolve grow stronger. He was not just fighting for his land. He was fighting for the dignity of every person who had ever been wronged by an HOA. As the trial progressed, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The judge, who had remained quiet and impartial up until that point, began to show signs of frustration. It became clear that he, too, was disturbed by the evidence that was being presented. The HOA, it seemed, had gone too far this time. They had abused their position of power, and now they would have to pay the price. The tension in the courtroom was thick as everyone waited for the judge to deliver his verdict. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally spoke. His voice was firm, resolute, as he addressed the court. "The actions of this homeowners association have been nothing short of disgraceful," he began, his eyes scanning the room. It is clear to me that they have violated not only the law but the trust of the people they were meant to serve. They have acted with malice and disregard for the well-being of the residents of this community. This cannot go unpunished." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. For a moment, Marcus could hardly breathe. He had fought for so long, and now, it seemed like the tide was finally turning in his favor. The judge continued, laying out his findings. "The sale of Marcus's property is hereby deemed illegal, and the HOA is ordered to reverse the transaction immediately. Furthermore, the HOA will face a full investigation into their practices, and any individuals found responsible for this wrongdoing will be held accountable. As for the damages caused to Marcus and his family, the HOA will be required to pay compensation for emotional distress, financial losses, and any other costs incurred due to their actions." The courtroom erupted in a mix of relief and disbelief. Marcus's eyes welled up with tears as he looked around at his neighbors, his friends, his family people who had stood by him through thick and thin. This wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for everyone who had ever felt powerless against an institution like the HOA. It was a victory for justice, for the truth, and for the power of ordinary people coming together to fight for what's right. The HOS lawyers, now visibly defeated, had no response. They knew that the game was up. Their clients had been exposed for the corrupt, power-hungry individuals they were, and no amount of legal maneuvering could save them now. The judge's ruling was final, and the damage had been done. The HOA would have to pay, and they would have to face the consequences of their actions. Marcus, still processing the magnitude of the moment, felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had won. But as he looked around at the faces of his neighbors, he knew that the real victory wasn't just in reclaiming his home. It was in the strength they had found as a community. The fight had brought them together, united them in ways they had never imagined. And now they were stronger than ever. In the weeks that followed, the victory was felt throughout the neighborhood. The HOA's corrupt practices were exposed, and changes began to be made to the laws governing homeowners associations. People who had once lived in fear of their HOA now felt empowered to stand up for themselves, knowing that they had the power to make a difference. Marcus's victory had sparked a movement, and it was a movement that would continue to grow. As for Marcus, he returned home to his family, knowing that the fight had been worth it. He had reclaimed his land, but more importantly, he had reclaimed his sense of justice. He had stood up against an oppressive system and come out victorious. And in doing so, he had proven that even the smallest voice, when united with others, could take down the most powerful institutions. A new beginning with the HOA's corruption. Finally exposed, Marcus and his neighbors began rebuilding their lives. The community, once fractured and fearful, was now stronger than ever. They had fought for their homes, their rights, and their dignity, and in the end, they had won. Marcus's journey had not only reclaimed his land, but had also inspired a movement that would echo throughout the country, changing the way homeowners associations operated forever. It was a victory not just for Marcus, but for every person who had ever stood up against injustice.